Welcome back to the backyard team. So we're going to have a look at setting up a top rope today. Lots of different ways that you can do this, as with most things in climbing. We're going to look at hopefully a fairly simple way that we can run through. First things first, it's really good to have a look at what the equipment is that we might actually need today. So what I'm using is a couple of ropes here. So I'm going to be using my static line for my setup. This green rope here is a static line of rope, but that's actually going to be what we would normally consider as my dynamic rope. I've got a couple of rope protectors that I can be using, some steel carabiners, my safety line with an alloy carabiner, and then I've got myself a Prusik. My retaining wall here is going to be the edge of my cliff, or what we'll pretend is the edge of my cliff, and I'm going to be using my tree, my apricot tree, as our anchor today. Just want to make note that this apricot tree wouldn't be sufficient as a sole anchor, but we will be having a look at it in the sense that we will be tying to two separate anchors, and the two branches here will be representing those anchors. So I like to have all my equipment ready to go where I need it. Gives me an opportunity to safely check everything off. So I've now actually got the carabiners, my Prusik line, and the tape on my harness. I've then got my ropes and things that I'll be tying off to my anchors up by my anchor or next to my anchor, and then that gives me an opportunity just to check everything, flake out the ropes as we go, and make sure that we're using equipment that's in good working order. First things first, I need to establish a line that I can work from and tie off initially to my anchor. So I'm going to take my static rope and just check that everything's in working order. So in the initial instance, I'm just going to flake my rope out to make sure that there's no knots and tangles and that I can work with it. But also in this process, what I'm doing is I'm checking along with my fingers, checking the sheath, that there's not damage to the outer of the rope, and that we can actually work nice and easily with that. And I'm also running along and checking to see whether I can feel any damage to the inside or the core of the rope. So I'm checking for flat spots or really obvious bumps or things that just don't feel as they should. Once I've got that established, I know that I've now got a rope that I can work with. I'm going to tie my initial figure of 8 to be able to tie that to my anchor. First stage is that you're establishing your anchor that you can then work from. I need to be cautious and aware that the edge of the cliff is behind me, so I'm actually kneeling down a safe distance from the cliff, because once I've got that tied on, I am going to set my Prusik line onto that line to keep myself nice and safe. Checking the angles here, and we'll refer back to that a little bit later on, but really important that I check that this is to a solid anchor. Checking my knot, 2, 4, 6, 8 and 10. I've got my teardrop to where I've tied, and I've got my gnarly length of rope out the other end. I need to just check that this is nice and tight, but I don't want to be pulling directly back to the edge of the cliff, because if it wasn't tight and it wasn't tight, the rope might feed through and I would go with that. So from this anchor, I could be testing down, could be testing up or back in the other direction. Friction knots to actually work. So you need to have a good understanding of your equipment, what can be done with it, but also in this instance, things like the diameters for working. Prusik line should always be at least 3 millimeters thinner in diameter than what your working line is. So my working line is a 10.5 mil static rope, and I know that I'm working on a 6 mil Prusik. So I do have over that minimum of 3 meters. Tying in here and establishing a safety. So I'm tying a Klemheist friction knot or a Klemheist Prusik with my 3 wraps, passing back through my original bite, making sure that the double fisherman's is not in this knot here. Okay, before I attach it and before I put myself into any sort of dangerous position, I'm checking that that friction knot is working, it's releasing, and it's still working after it's been released. Then clipping my Prusik to my harness and doing all of my checks. So checking back at my knot, because that's what's keeping my line in order. checking my prusik knot and tensioning it at this point, and checking that that is clipped to my carabiner. Don't also forget to check that double fisherman's, because that was already in the system, but not assuming that it's exactly what it needs to be. From this point, I keep tension on that prusik line and I bring that back down with me. I'm not grabbing onto that knot, because if it needs to actually take effect, I want it to grab. You can see that I'm setting myself in a position where under tension on that prusik line, I am at a working position next to the edge of the cliff. Next thing for me to do is to check where I want my carabiners and my rope to actually hang, ensuring that once I attach my dynamic line off the edge of the cliff, that's not going to be rubbing and catching, particularly over the edge, but in any cracks or secondary ledges, if I can avoid that. So once I've measured that distance, I'm bringing that bite back up and I'm tying my first figure of 8 on a bite. Tidying that knot up. And I then like to double check that it is hanging in a good position. Okay, always continuing along the line. So I've tied off to my anchor, I've worked down to my first figure of 8, continue to work along, and I'm going to separate my second figure 8, or what will become my backup line, my secondary line, from my original. Again, taking a bite and tying another figure 8 on the bite. I then like to, because I've got everything with me on my harness ready to go, set my steel carabiners on the end. You can use an alloy carabiner here, but just have a look at those differences between steel and alloy, and it's much better to be using those steel carabiners, because in our top rope setting, this is where we'll get lots of movement and the potential for those carabiners to be knocking against the edge of the cliff all day. Okay, put those in a position that I can then continue to work. And again, I'm just going to flake my dynamic rope. This time, because I'm by the edge of the cliff, I'm actually going to coil that rope as I flake it over my neck, on my shoulders. And that's going to bring me to a position, taking out all of the knots, or twists or tangles that might be in that line, to where I've now got the center of my rope. Take my steel carabiners and I'm going to clip the center of my rope to both of them. I have my carabiners opposing, they're both clipped through both of those figure 8 bites that we'd established, and I have my gates what we would call opposing each other, or on opposite sides, so that if there was any reason that the gate were to knock against the cliff and open, that it would only be one of those carabiners that would be impacted. But let's ensure that those sorts of things don't happen, and at this point I'm just going to tighten that carabiner up and lock it off, because we don't need to use those carabiners again. Good habit to get into in finishing the things that you're currently working on, as opposed to assuming that you'll come back to them. You'll also notice that the gates of my carabiners tighten in a downwards direction. Again, that's very deliberate, that if any turning of those gates on the carabiners did occur, that it is likely to turn in a downwards direction. So with it set in this fashion, that turning would actually cause the gate to close as opposed to open. Not throwing anything around here, just dangling that set up over the edge of the cliff. And at this point, that gives me the opportunity, because we are tied in, to throw that rope off the edge. Before that occurs though, making sure that all of our calls are in place. So I'm looking over the edge of the cliff, rope below, and allowing that to fall down. I like to do a double check here, because occasionally these carabiners like to flip, but it gives me the opportunity just to quickly do a 2, 4, 6, 8 and 10 on my knots, as well as a check on both of those carabiners and that the directions are all working well. I can then continue along that line of rope, so working back on the end that I've not worked with, and taking my prusik knot up with me as I go. So I've worked back to my anchor, or another anchor here, and this is going to give me an opportunity to ensure that I'm sitting and abiding by the principles of Serenia in setting up a top rope. And I'm going to clip back my working end of rope to another anchor here. There, as always, is a few ways that you can do this, but what I'm going to do today is use a tape that I've pre-tied. Again, really good to check that that knot is working on the tape there. I'm going to double that over. Not going to girth hitch because of the reduction of strength in the tape with a girth hitch, but I'm going to double that over. And in this setting, I'm using a steel carabiner because I have it. There are disadvantages in terms of weight, but in this setting, I'm not too worried about weight in a top rope setting. So the strength and durability that I gain from a steel carabiner is why I've selected it. Okay, I'm going to show you two ways that I might be able to tie back to this carabiner here. The first is I like to go straight to a figure 8 on the bite. It's a really strong, reliable end of line knot that I can use, but it's just a little bit difficult to adjust to get equalization in the line if you get it kind of out of position. What I like to do though, however, is take the bite of rope that I'm going to tie my figure 8 and measure that with my tape under tension and rope under tension just in behind or to the top of the carabiner. Okay, I then at that point tie my figure 8 on a bite, bring that carabiner back to position, and you'll find a little bit of tension just to get it over the lip, but then that we're in a pretty equalized position with my two lines of rope, ensuring here, because we're about to finish this part of the job, that we tighten off that carabiner and double check it. You'll notice the same principle as the carabiners over the edge of the cliff, in that my gate is tightening down towards the cliff, that if any sort of gravity were to impact or knocking were to impact, that this would tighten down, but also that the spine, the stronger part of my carabiner, is where, if at all, it's going to knock against rock. So I want you to be conscious of the direction of your carabiner and the position of your gate when you're tying your top ropes. Let's also ensure that this whole system is really nice, neat and tidy. So I'm just doing a lazy coil with the rest of my rope over my hand. You can tighten that coil off if you like, but I like to then just position that underneath. So we've got a nice neat setup here, and one last job that we've got to do before we do our final checks, and that's ensuring that any of the rope that needs protecting is protected. So I've got my rope protectors here, bringing my prusik back down with me to a position where it's nicely tensioned, and I'm going to set a rope protector on each of these lines just over the edge of the cliff. These ropes are right next to each other. You can use the one rope protector for both lines, but it's quite common that you'll have these lines of rope separated from each other. And me just being a little bit fussy, I have deliberately kept the vinyl of these rope protectors on the inside, the canvas on the outside. Often you'll see them set up with the canvas on the outside because of the way that they're made, but in my mind that canvas is just more durable than what that vinyl side is. So just protecting the equipment, but also not leaving little specks and flakes of vinyl out in the environment that we're actually using. So there we go, we've used those rope protectors to protect the rope itself from the harsher parts of the edge of the cliff there, and if I needed to I could put more rope protectors in different positions. Anchor there, back down, we've got protection on that line of rope. Just going to lift this with me here and recheck my 2, 4, 6, 8 and 10. 2, 4, 6, 8 and 10. Both my carabiners are clipped, my dynamic line is through both of those carabiners, and my gates are facing the direction that I want. Continue then to work back up the line to the top, and I'm checking my end of line knot at 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. rechecking that carabiner and ensuring that tape is set nicely around the anchor with the tape knot appropriately tied. At this point though, I just will show you that second way of finishing off that line of rope. Not the only two ways by any means, but we'll just work here with a clove hitch. The advantage of the clove hitch is it's really quickly and easily adjustable, but the disadvantage is the potential for slippage and the slight reduction of strength when comparing against that figure of 8 knot. So I can clip my clove hitch straight to the carabiner, do my double check, making sure that the tension line is what is closest to the spine or the strongest part of the carabiner. But like I said just before, really easy to readjust your tension. So pull your tension line up to the point where you've got equal tension on that line, and then pulling my other end of rope, okay? Ensuring that then we put our backup in place. So I like to tie, like I've done in my clove hitch video, a little figure 8 on the bight in behind it. And then clip that in next to my clove hitch. And at that point, if that was the end of my setup, I would then go through and do my final checks again. I can actually be, I'm removing my carabiner from the prusik knot, and I'm taking my prusik line off. Always finish off your jobs so that there's no question as to whether you're tied in or not. Then tidying up my prusik knot or my prusik line and clipping that back to my harness. Let's climb. So let's just have a look at the Serenia principles for setting a top rope up on what we've done. So SA at the start of Serenia, standing for solid anchors. So what we would need to establish is whether our anchors are solid. In Adelaide, we will often use bollards in common top roping areas, but really important that you make those assessment of your anchors if you're using trees or natural protection in rocks and things like that. I've very deliberately used 2 separate branches, but there is an argument to be made here that this is actually only one singular anchor. It's what I have available to me in my backyard, but I wouldn't necessarily consider top roping of this particular setup. But if we were to continue through, we look for the R in SAR of Serenia. So we're looking for redundancies. So we've got this idea that we have separate anchors that are actually set up. And then through our system, the concept that we have 2 separate lines that we're working with for a redundancy, as well as over the edge, when we look at the separation of those 2 lines into our 2 figure of 8s that are used, one for each of our lines, as well as 2 carabiners. Okay. Our E stands for equalized. So what we're looking for is that we have equal tension on both of those lines. So not only are they redundant, but we have equal tension so that the weight has been distributed evenly between those anchors. If it's not equalized, we've got our easy adjustment here to either let more line out or take more line in. That leads us on to the next part of Serenia, SA, R, E, NE, no extension. So the idea here is that when we've got equalization, we also need to be conscious of the angles of our ropes and those sorts of things, that if something in the system were to fail, that there would not be any extension on any other part of the system. So if our carabiner were to fail here and we were to lose the protection from this line, that in equalizing the weight on both of them, there's not going to be a sudden jolt or pull on any other part of the system, creating excessive force that we didn't initially have and we don't need to have if something were to actually happen. And the final part of Serenia being our final A, we need to look at the angles that are created at each point within our system. This is about the force that's generated on the rope. We are looking absolutely for any angle to be under 120 degrees. That's the absolute top point. If we've got any angles that are more than 120 degrees, we're actually generating more force on each of the line than if we just had a singular line in play. Ideally though, we're looking for our angles to be less than 90 degrees, because at that point we've got some equal sharing of the load between those two lines, but even better if we're sitting at about that 45 degrees. Okay, so absolutely no negotiation, has to be under 120 degrees for any angle. Ideally we're looking for less than 90 to allow some sharing of the weight or the forces between our lines, and then even more ideally looking for less than 45 degrees. I'll give you some examples. If this was tied really tight up against this anchor, you can see that our angles would increase, but in extending that knot out a little bit further, we reduce the angle. We're also looking at the angle between the two lines of rope that are working down towards the cliff in our redundancies, and in each of those scenarios we have our angles at less than 45 degrees. Okay, so look for the angles that are present in anything that you've tied along that system. So we're finished climbing for the day. We're going to pack down our setup, but we also need to be conscious that this needs to be done safely as well. Most of what we will do will be in reverse order from when we were doing this setup, but like our setup, the absolute first thing we need to do is establish our own safety. We don't need to tie that anchor, but a good idea just to check it at the end of the day as well. So I have tied to my anchor, check my 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and the rest of that knot. For no particular reason, I'll let you look at some friction knot videos. I'm going to tie a slightly different prusik here. So I'm going to tie a classic prusik this time. 1, 2, 3 rounds, slightly offsetting my double fisherman's knot. And then just a quick tidy up of that prusik. So I have a nice neat classic prusik, testing the strength, working down, testing that it's releasable and re-engaging. So just bringing that back up to the top of the anchor, clip that to my harness, and I've checked that carabiner. So now that I'm safe, I can actually start that process of packing down. I like to just bring the entire system up from the cliff. I've centered my rope when I was down the bottom, but I am just going to bring that whole line up. Undoing my little knot that I've established, and then at this point I'm going to coil my rope. I like to use that time also as I bring it up and as I coil it to just do that check that my equipment's in good working order. So looking for those flat spots or any damage to the sheath and those sorts of things as well. So that I've got everything now up from the edge of the cliff. Again, finish your jobs off as you do them, so I'm not leaving any equipment lying around, half done coils of rope and things like that. Can finish off that coil and place that ready for pack up. Then take my carabiners off and attach them straight to my harness, ready to be put back in the bags. And I can untie my figure of 8s and allow that to sit ready for coiling and pack up once everything's untied. Taking off my rope protectors and getting them ready for storage, making sure that they're not going to fly away. Setting that underneath my coiled rope, and then my static line is where I'm talking about working in reverse. So I know that I'm tied to my original anchor that was established, so it's not what I'm going to be taking off because I am still in the cliff zone here. Undoing my backup knot, going to get my end of rope ready that I can start to work with and don't have to find it once I take everything out. And again, finishing this job off here in taking my tape off of the anchor and setting that on my harness ready for pack away, and not leaving those sorts of things lying around. Then working all the way back up to the top of my setup, and before I remove that knot, I like to remove my prusik, then knowing that I'm going to be out of the system. So that's why I've got myself into this position back from the anchor. So removing my carabiner, and removing my prusik. Again, tidying that up, clipping that on my harness. That makes me aware that I'm not at all tied in, so that I can untie the rope from the anchor. If I were to untie the anchor first, there's the potential that I've got this thought process that my prusik is still in the system and I'm still safe. So I like just to take that off before I remove it from the anchor, to know that once that anchor is untied, I'm not going to be in the system anyway. And then in my safe position, we're going to finish this process off by coiling my last rope. Again, taking any twirls and twists and things like that out of the rope, and doing my double check for any damage that might have occurred in that process. Finishing off my coil. And then I've got my nice neat little pile of equipment, as well as what I've then got on my harness, ready to pack in my bag and head home.